Hello. Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here with us in our double-header lecture series on this very special May the 4th Thursday. Can you hear me? I've lost it. It was fine and now it's not working. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Laura Eklund. I am the Senior Collection Manager of Anthropology here at the California Academy of Sciences, and I am currently the ranking anthropologist at the Academy of Sciences, but I'm delighted that in a few months we'll have a new curator on board and I can no longer be ranking. So I'd just like to start with a moment of silence in recognition of the Ohlone and other indigenous peoples on whose land we are currently residing. Unceded land, I recognize their expertise, their knowledge, their claim in the past, in the present, and the future. So, speaking about the past, we are going to talk about the ancient past here on Earth. I'd like to welcome. Can you hear me? I feel like it's not, okay. I'll just shout. I'll shout, and if it's not working, that's fine. It's good thing it's a friendly audience in here. I would like to welcome Dr. Carol Ward, who has come to us from the University of Missouri in Columbia, which is their main campus. She is the curator's distinguished professor of pathology and anatomical studies. And she specializes in the evolution of apes and early hominids with a focus on the fossil record in East Africa and South Africa. She's co-leading the West Turkana Paleo Project, which is a paleontological fieldwork project in Kenya, aiming to find fossil evidence of early hominids and their environments. That's a great place to look for those remains. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ward to share her work.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you who are here and who are out there online. I hope you can hear me all right. I tend to be very loud. It's not usually a problem for me. So thanks all for coming. And I'm interested in human evolution, and I'm interested in the story of how this phenomenal species that we are came to be. And I'm interested in the beginning of the story because all good stories start at the beginning. And I'm interested in the fossil record of the earliest members of our clade, or our branch of the family tree. Because if we can understand how those creatures were different maybe from other apes and other relatives, we'll have an idea how our incredible journey began and how our lineage got its start. And so that's one of the major reasons I'm interested in looking at the earlier part of the human fossil record. But also, if we understand what the earliest hominins were like, we then have the raw material that selection acted upon to create later species of Homo, including our genus Homo erectus. So it's the middle of the story and the beginning of the story all at the same time. And the earliest members of the family tree that I'm going to talk about are from the genus called Australopithecus, which meant southern ape man. It was originally named in South Africa by an anatomist some time back, almost 100 years ago. And this is a collection of multiple species. Here happen to be some examples. I'm trying to impress you with the fact that we actually have a lot of fossils of these species. There may be anywhere between 4 and 8 species, depending on who you ask and which day you ask us. But there are a lot of different fossils, and we're actually learning a lot about what these creatures are like. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my part of the story as we go today. So when we're looking at our evolution, we can look at the diversity of apes that live in the world today, and all of them are very similar animals, except for one. One is different. Most of the rest of them are very similar in a way, and they tend to have very long arms, very strong fingers, very short backs, short legs, and they tend to spend most of the time in the trees, moving around using essentially 4 hands to negotiate this complex, flexible branch environment. Some of these animals get very, very large, and so they need to have a lot of anatomical adaptation that facilitate life in the trees. Trees are great places to avoid predators. They're full of fruits and foods. Fruits grow on the ends of branches, so these animals have found a way to negotiate this environment very, very well. And it would seem on the face of it, if all you had was a view of the present, that an animal like one of these would be something like what we would evolve from. They're all very similar. So it's most parsimonious to assume that our ancestors would have looked something like one of the modern apes. Now, that either is or isn't true, but it's very significant because when great apes in particular come to the ground, they have these huge, heavy upper bodies, these huge, big, long arms and hands, these very stiff backs that I'll talk a lot about today. So when they come down to the ground, they usually tend to drop down on all fours and walk in knuckle walking. African apes in particular, chimps and gorillas, spend a lot of the time on the ground, and they're also semi-specialized for moving on the ground on 4 feet. So it's natural to assume, looking at the present, that in fact, our ancestors would have been something like a modern great ape. We know that apes evolved over 20 million years ago from animals that walked on all fours up on tops of branches, much like monkeys do today. We have ancestral ape fossils. There's quite a number of them. I won't go through them all. There are a lot of these animals. They all sort of show a similar way of moving around the world. And the way these animals move around the world is really significant. So we know all apes started as these quadrupedal animals. Once we get onto our branch of the family tree, up into our clade, we have Australopithecus that I'll talk a lot about today. There are some slightly older members of probably our clade. They're less well known, less well understood. They may have begun to have some of the adaptations that I'll be talking about, but I'm not really going to talk about them today, though they're really cool and super interesting. And we actually have quite a big fossil record of apes in between. In the Miocene, so from about 20-ish to about 5-ish million years ago, there were dozens and dozens of great ape species that lived in Africa, Europe, and Asia. And there are quite a number of them. In the early Miocene, these are these above branch quadrupedal stem hominoids, I'm calling them for the sake of simplicity. We move up to maybe 12 to 15 million years ago. In the middle Miocene, we start seeing more of these animals. And then towards the end of the Miocene, we tend to start to see ones that are more closely related, perhaps, to African apes and humans. Anybody who does any cladistics is probably rolling their eyes about now at my flippant use of brackets to work these in. There's a lot of debate over the details of the specific phylogenetic relationships among all these groups. But for my purposes today, the main point is that not a one of these fossil apes is as specialized in its locomotor adaptations, if you will, as modern apes are. None of them look as specialized as the living taxa. What we have is a series of probably relic populations, in a way, of apes that are alive today. And that colors our interpretations and our understanding of the trajectory of changes that led to our ancestry and also to the evolution of all these other groups. For example, we have one ape here that's pretty plausibly related to modern orangutans, and it's still walking around above branches for the most part. Most of these middle Miocene apes that fit somewhere in here, if you like, they're still not particularly specialized for climbing trees. And only in the very latest species that tend to be in Europe and Asia do we start to see animals that are starting to do things we would consider, from our present day lens, more apey, moving around in the trees upright using their forelimbs. So when we put all of these other apes into our picture and we try to then look at parsimony to try to interpret what our ancestors would be like, the water gets much, much muddier. And there's indications, this is a spoiler, that maybe modern apes are not our best model for how for what our ancestors would have been like, our last common ancestor, at least, that would have shared with chimps. But maybe there was something a little bit more primitive in a way, if you'd like to use that word. But it affects our understanding of the trajectory changes that led to Australopithecus in humans. So there are new fossils and new understandings that we have about how these animals were built and how they put together and maybe how they moved. And I'm going to talk a little bit about an example from Australopithecus. What is some of our current understanding? And I'm also going to talk about a little bit of the Miocene. I promise you not too much, or we'd be here until next Thursday. So I'm going to talk about body shape, because it turns out that body shape is really important for understanding how animals move around in the world. We think of limbs, we think of walking on feet, we think of grasping with our hands, we look at limb proportions. We think a lot about limbs when we're trying to understand how a fossil animal that doesn't have a modern analog may have moved around. But it turns out body shape is really significant. So if we look at this gorilla here, this is my poster child for apes right now, and you compare that to a human, you can see quite a few differences. First of all, the gorilla has this really long pelvis, a very, very short lumbar spine in their lower back, and an almost cone-shaped rib cage that really reaches right down to that pelvis. That torso is very, very stiff. It doesn't move at all. What this does for the gorilla or the orangutan or the chimpanzee is it provides a very stiff platform for all of the muscles of the upper limb that they use as they're moving around in the trees, pulling themselves around by their upper limbs. And again, it means that makes it more difficult for them to stand up and move around on 2 feet when they are on the ground. We'll talk more about that later. Humans, on the other hand, have this nice short pelvis, this nice long spine, this nice waist, and we use that to swivel our hips as we move around. Human bipedality is very smooth and efficient. We can walk long distances without expending a lot of energy compared to many animals. And it's our body build of our trunk that's really important for the fluidity of our motion and the efficiency of our bipedal gait. It's very different from what we see in a modern gorilla or chimpanzee. And if you go to your probably favorite biological anthropology textbook and you look at what Australopithecus body shape would have been, you might see something like this. This is based on some reconstructions that were done quite a long time ago by Peter Schmid, before we had a lot of the fossils that we now have today. And you can see the pelvis here looks very human-like. We had fossil pelvises, so we're pretty sure about that. Wasn't a lot of information back then on the lumbar spine. It probably wasn't just a rod. And then you had this very sort of cone-shaped rib cage, which at the time was not a terrible reconstruction. And if you sort of use your mind and you fill in the soft tissues here, you might imagine that Australopithecus would have had not much of a waist, sort of maybe sort of big pot belly, if you will, and would have been built very different from a nice body build like we have with a waist in the middle. And this reconstruction's been really significant because it's been used to infer gut size and diet in fossil ancestors, and there'd be changes inferred from these sorts of things, in addition to locomotor reconstructions and so forth. So it's been really significant, but we have a lot of fossils that have come in since these reconstructions were made. We have, for example, several partial spines of Australopithecus. And what we can see, all of them show evidence of these distinctive human spinal curvatures. I won't go through all the evidence for you, that allows us to get our body weight up over our 2 feet for efficient balance when we're walking around upright on 2 feet, as opposed to being hunched over in this nice arc that you see in the chimpanzee here, or pick your favorite quadruped. We have a number of these different spines, and we can definitely see the presence of these curvatures. We can also see that there would have been 5 lumbar or non-rib bearing lower back vertebrae, just like us. So the vertebral column is very, very similar to ours in many ways. And there's a lot of anatomical minutiae that support this interpretation. For those of you from Cal Academy that remember Zariah Elam-Zeged's very famous fossil that he discovered called from the Leakey site in Ethiopia. This is a child skeleton, nearly 3.4 million years old. And it's remarkable because it has a huge part of the vertebral column preserved. And we can see that from other specimens, we have the full complement of 5 lower back vertebrae. This shows us that there were only 12 thoracic or rib-bearing vertebrae. And that's significant because a lot of apes, African apes, tend to have 13. So it's another indication that the Australopithecus torso shape would have been really much more human-like than perhaps like something you'd see in a chimpanzee. This is the first partial torso skeleton of Australopithecus. It was found in the 60s. This is Robert Broom, and this is the block of breccia that this came from. These fossils are found in South African caves, and they come out in basically hunks of brick with bones in them. You can kind of imagine there's a little bit of a pelvis there, and this beautiful specimen was contained in this block. It was prepared out many years ago, and we have this pelvis and vertebral column from this individual. But they're also a big, like with most fossils, there's a box of fragments that are in the same drawers. And we went through these and we were actually able to identify ribs. And ribs are significant because they're small, they're friable. We don't tend to see them very often in the fossil record, and they actually can convey some information. Now, any of you who's not maybe as nerdy as me is looking at this and thinking, well, that's pretty underwhelming. Some of these aren't even very big. It's like, I was really excited about this. But it actually turns out to be significant. So this is a thoracic skeleton of a chimpanzee. Again, you see the cone-shaped rib cage, if I get my pointer to work, short lower back, very long pelvis. And when you look at the way those ribs attach to the vertebral column, they will attach at the one place, right, the vertebral body here. And there's another attachment here in what's called the transverse process. And that's locked down. There's a synovial joints. They move a little bit. And if you look at the lower part of the rib cage, so this is going from the last rib up, you can see in chimpanzees, this is that attachment here for the transverse process. And there's a big old synovial joint in the bottom one and all the way up, and I could keep going. When you look at us, we have two what are called floating ribs. These are ones that people like Scarlett O'Hara would get removed. They have very small waists, but they don't really have a strong articulation with the transverse process. What this does is it makes them just a little bit more mobile. They're not locked down there by a lot of fibrous tissue. And we can see this is the Lucy skeleton, the famous Lucy from Hadar, Ethiopia, 3 million-year-old hominid. Here's a vertebrae. You see the big old articulation for the transverse process here. And there's one below it, at least, and it's pretty big. No attachment whatsoever. Well, we don't know if that's the last or second to last or what have you. But fortunately, the little bits from STS-14, that South African skeleton, there are at least 2 of the lower ribs that have no attachment for the transverse process. What this means then is, like humans and unlike chimps, there would have been more mobility in those last couple of ribs, and that would contribute to that pivoting motion that we do when we swivel our hips and we're walking around. And we can see that now in Australopithecus. So that, I think, is kind of cool. So this is just a graph from some work by Nathan Thompson, where he actually had humans and chimps moving. And when humans move, when humans move, we swivel our waist. All right, you can't see me on the video here, but we twist our waist. And so what you can see is that our rib cage is moving one direction, and our rib cage move one direction, our pelvis can move the other direction, it can swivel around. A chimpanzee, though, is stiff, and its whole body just lurches from side to side as it's walking around. And that helps it get more the pelvic step, it gets more stride length. Australopithecus, by virtue of the construction of the lower part of its torso, would have been able to have torso movements much more like the human than we see in the chimpanzee, with more vertebrae, less tightly bound lower ribs. So that's indicating that, in fact, they were able to stand upright and move a lot like we did. We actually have more ribs that are showing up in the fossil record, which is fantastic. We can measure the curvature of those ribs. It doesn't really matter how. And you can plot those out. So this is the top of the rib cage moving down to about the middle. We'll just stop there for now. And you can see that humans here have much more curvature of their ribs up in the upper part of the rib cage than any of the great apes do, which are over here in blue. You can also see that the rib cage here is showing that same sort of thing, sort of bulgier at the top, if you will, as opposed to be like a cone. Now, this is originally thought to have a cone-shaped rib cage at the top, which allow you to swivel your shoulder blade up and reach above the trees and so on and so forth. And so that this would be indication of maybe arboreality or not arboreality. We have our 2 fossil hominids, and they're looking very human-like again. So does that mean they didn't climb trees? Well, if we expand our search a little bit, we can see that gibbons and siamangs, which are those hand-over-hand small ape brachiators, also have a much wider rib cage up here and near the top, like humans, like our fossil hominids as well. So this probably doesn't necessarily have to do with being arboreal per se. It might have to do some other aspects of torso shape. But what we can say is Australopithecus was much more human-like in its upper rib cage as well as its lower rib cage in terms of how it's constructed. So if we can make a sort of newish view of Australopithecus, if you will, incorporating all this information, you can see the chimp here with sort of tubby midsection, if you will, this very short, stiff torso. Australopithecus would have built much more like you or I, a little shorter, a little stockier, few differences here and there, a little bit longer arms, a little bit different shoulders, and so on and so forth, but fundamentally quite human-like. And very significantly, they'd also last an appreciably good at grasping big toe. There's some debate about there might have been a little mobility or not, but fundamentally, these animals are not only good at standing and walking, they'd really given up the abilities to be good in the trees. They could do it maybe sort of in a mediocre way, but nothing like we see in modern great apes. So when we look at Australopithecus, there's nothing really in terms of its torso shape that's particularly much like a modern great ape, like a chimp or like a gorilla. And so when we're thinking about the ancestral condition, there's nothing in Australopiths per se that says that this type of a body shape model is really what we should be looking to try to explain human evolution. So if we come back to our cladogram here, we can take a look back further in time. So we don't see anything particularly chimp-like, at least in the torso anatomy of chimps and gorillas, that suggest this stiff torso that maybe would associated with even a knuckle walking heritage or something. There's nothing really there that we can point to. But what if we go back a little bit further in time and look at some of these Miocene apes? I'm going to talk about my work on an animal called Rudipithecus, because it highlights some of the story that I want to talk about today. So to do this, I'm going to go back many, many years ago, essentially, not just to my dissertation, but in my dissertation where I took advantage of the work of Adolf Schultz between the 30s and the 60s, really came up with most of the stories. And I've been telling this story for a really long time. So when you look at the rib cage of monkeys versus apes, we're going to set humans aside for a moment. When we look at something like a monkey that's walking around above branches, or an ape that's moving around orthograde, holding its body upright under the trees, monkeys tend to have a very narrow rib cage. The shoulder joint is facing straight down to the ground, which helps that monkey move around in its quadrupedal locomotor way that it likes to do, where the apes have this broad thorax, which moves the scapulae around, so they're facing out to the side, which facilitates adduction movements and climbing around in the trees. This is the story we've been telling for all of this time, is that this movement to reorient the shoulder joint has changed the shape of the body. My dissertation, there you go, it was a little while ago now. And the pelvis here is thought to mirror this shape of the torso. So it's much wider in these apes. You sort of have the whole iliac blades are turned and flared around, and in response, it's all about the shoulder. Okay, that's how the story's gone. The other aspect of the torso that's significant when we're trying to look at apes and monkeys is going to be the length of that spine. Monkeys have an even longer than ours lumbar spine. It's very flexible, like you can see this longer drinking here, as opposed to the stiff shape that you see in the great apes. And so if those Miocene apes were built had torsos much more like the gorilla here, that would give us one hypothesis of the changes that led to Australopithecus, as opposed to something that was a little bit more monkey-like or like those early Miocene apes. So this becomes a really significant question. And I perhaps made the mistake of continuing to work on this problem, and I've changed a lot of my understanding of why it's all happening, and we'll walk you through that a little bit. I embarked on a project quite a few years ago now where we went and collected CT scans of cadaveric specimens of primates, and we were able to look at the whole torso altogether, because it's really annoying to study things like vertebrae and ribs, and you go to the museum and there's a box of them all rattling around at the bottom of the box, and you got to figure out how they fit. They don't fit together. It's really hard to study. So CT scanning has been really terrific for enables to visualize the variation that we see. And I hope you're impressed at how much variation there is in terms of length of the pelvis, length of the spine, width of the whole thing. But it also lets us to quantify and compare body shape differences among taxa. And so if we look at these sort of a top-down view, I know these look like Burgess Shale animals to probably most people. This is sort of almost a bird's eye view of the rib cage and pelvis here. And these are monkeys up here in blue, and they do seem to have a narrower rib cage than the apes down here on the bottom, and humans looking pretty much like an ape in this case. So that kind of seems to fit our hypothesis of shape differences. That all works. And if you look carefully, you can see in orange here, I've colored in the top part of the pelvis, the iliac blades. And you can see here, they seem to be more flared out, if you will, in the apes compared to the monkeys. So this is looking like a case of, yeah, we already knew that, right? Well, yes, it's true. But there's going to be some nuances here that I think are really significant, and I'm going to walk you through that. So we can take a bunch of landmarks on these intact torsos for people who like actual data, and we can do a principal components analysis of all these different shapes. And this shows us apes are over here with a much sort of broader rib cage. You see the ribs are very curved than we tend to see in the monkeys. And there's more information in this, but we'll just move off it. But it does seem to support metrically that, in fact, what we're seeing with our eye is true. So, okay, nothing's changed so far. Thinking about it, a number of studies have come out over the last few years that show, Leakey Chan was able to show, for example, that monkeys and apes have about the same range of shoulder mobility as each other, even though there's really different torso anatomies, which tells you, which makes me wonder about the root cause of these rib cage shape differences. We also know that scapulae vary tremendously. And I showed you those graphs showing that how, at least at the upper part of the rib cage, gibbons and humans had a pretty similar shape. There's gibbons and humans, and the scapula and shoulders are very, very different. So shoulders are really interesting. They're really cool. They're really important, but they're not as tightly tied to rib cage shape as we have always thought. So what is going on? Well, when we look at this rib cage here, what we see is that here's the human, or the hominoid, pardon me, which is just an ape, and the rib curves way back from the vertebral body. The center of motion's up in the vertebral body. It arches way back and then curves around. And so we can think of the vertebral body being invaginated into that thoracic cavity. And this is something that the very small handful of people in the world that worry about vertebrae think about quite a bit. Whereas the monkey, the ribs almost kind of come straight out from the vertebrae, if you will. And this is some work. Blake Sarazin was an undergraduate in my lab. He's off being a physician now. He measured all this for us. And so if we look at the first thoracic vertebra, we can see, yeah, there's a little more invagination in humans and the apes here. And these are sort of more four-limb dominated climbing spider monkeys from South Africa. Or South America, not South Africa, South America, I knew that. We can look in the middle of the rib cage and near the bottom of the rib cage. And each time we can see that hominoids do, in fact, have the shape. They have moved that vertebral column into the rib cage, or if you want to think about it, they've pulled the posterior part of the ribs back away from the vertebrae. And what this does is this increases the moment or the leverage for all of the muscles that are supporting your back. They're called erector spinae, straightening the spine muscles, and they're further back. So effectively, you have to do use less energy to get the same amount of work done holding everything in place. And they are more invaginated, but the rib cage actually isn't wider. And when my postdoc brought this to me, Emily Middleton, I said, do it again. Do it again. I'm sure you must be doing something wrong. But just don't worry about any of the details here. It's not super important. But going from the first, third, fifth, moving down the rib cage, monkeys are in blue here, blue triangles. Apes are in purple circles. And then humans we're not too worried about at the moment. But at the top of the rib cage and at the bottom of the rib cage, apes aren't actually wider. They're a little bit wider of the middle, more of an arch shape, if you will, to the rib cage here. Through the middle of the rib cage, apes are a little bit wider, but it's not that big difference that we thought that was reorienting the scapulae, because they're not actually that much wider. Confusing. The reason they look wider is because they're just shorter. Apes have shorter rib cages than monkeys do. So not just the lumbar region is shorter, the whole rib cage is actually shorter too. So proportionally, it looks wider. It's not actually wider. And the shape is different, if you will, but they're not actually wider. Why do they have short rib cages? Where does this come from? The vertebrae themselves, the bones are just shorter. We've known this for the lumbar region. They have few and they're really short. Same thing's true in the thoracic region. Apes have just scrunched it all down. And you can see this actually. You didn't really have to do all this. You could just look at the orangutans and they have these sort of almost spherical looking. I like orangutans because they're the most extreme, so they really show it case well, but it works the same for chimps and gorillas. The much sort of shorter, wider torsos. More shorter torsos, then you see something like the monkeys here that are using that back for a little bit to flex and extend and moving around when they're walking and running. So what apes have done is they haven't necessarily widened the rib cage, they've shortened it, and they've changed the geometry. Even when we move a little bit further south and look at the pelvis, and after the great apes, the rib cage is right next to that pelvis. Even when we get down there, we can see, I've changed my color scheme, sorry about that. Monkeys are now the sort of reddish color. Apes are up here in greenish. Humans we're not paying attention to. And these New World monkeys, I color differently. That's okay. Doesn't matter. Everybody's pelvis is just about as wide. So that idea of widely flaring pelvis also isn't working. What happens is there's a lot of positive allometry, which means as you get bigger in body size, you become disproportionately shaped, wider. So here's a gibbon, so it's a Cocker Spaniel sized animal, and a chimpanzee and a large male 300-pound orangutan here. And you can see as they're getting larger, the geometry of the ilium, the upper part of the pelvis, is changing. So great apes look different from monkeys, partly just because they're big. So there's a big size component here. And as you get larger and larger, the pelvis gets wider and wider. So it's not so much a locomotor difference, this is a size effect. Very confusing. And what seems to be happening here, when we get those one hip bone at a time, like those of us who did our dissertations with the protractor and the string tied in the middle, measuring everything really scientifically, when you put the whole pelvis together and look at it intact, what you see is it's not wider from side to side. The back is narrower. That sacrum is much narrower. So the bones themselves are wider because they're pulled in towards the center. And so here you've got apes, they're much narrower than other things. And so I think what's happening here is all of these changes are not about shoulders, it's about the spine and the muscles around the spine. If you look at an ape versus a monkey, this is just a recolored figure from Owen Lovejoy's publications here. Here's the ape with this transverse process, just like we saw with the ribs pulled further back. The muscle mass, these are the muscles, this is the back, there's the front down here, they're lying on his belly. These erector spine are much, much smaller in mass than we see in the monkey. The monkey's got the long torso, it's moving it around quite a bit during locomotion, where the ape has stiffened everything up, it's shortened everything, it's stabilizing its torso with passive mechanisms rather than using muscular effort to do all of it, which as you get larger becomes exponentially harder to do in terms of energy expenditure and risk to your spinal cord and all the other kinds of things. So if we come back to our rib cages here and we take a look again, there's that what appears to be narrow shape where these ribs are just taken off from the vertebral column and shooting straight ventrally, essentially, instead of being back. Let's think about that pelvis again. Apes are supposed to have this flaring pelvis. We just learned it's not wider, but is it differently oriented? Well, if you measure the overall orientation, yeah, it is. Absolutely is. But if you look more carefully at the anatomy of it, things aren't so simple. If you look at this part of the pelvis called the iliac portion, this is where some of the gluteal extensor muscles and flexor muscles of the hip are attached on either side of this. It's very, very small in the ape, and it's very, very large, or very large in the ape, pardon me, and small in the monkey. And there's no difference between apes and monkeys. It's the same orientation. What's really different, though, is the part dorsal to that. This part back here, and this is where those erector spinae, the spinal muscles, are attaching. It's huge in the monkey. And what apes have done is they shrunk the size of it and they've pulled it inwards, what we saw in those graphs, because the erector spinae musculature is just smaller. What happens then is it changes the overall geometry of the whole structure just because of geometric proportions. And this is a diagram that Emily Middleton and I published a number of years ago, and it's just geometry. My 15-year-old daughter would be rolling her eyes like, oh, that we'd never use that. But you can see here, when you change this geometry and you make this wider and this part shorter, the hypotenuse of the triangle changes as well. So what we've been seeing all those years, people like me saying that there's this change in the pelvis, there is, but it's not what we thought. And we could see that by looking at this whole thing in 3D and put together. Well, there's the muscle colors in there too, because I think is responsible for this whole thing. You can take CT scans through the middle of the rib cage, now near the pelvis and the lumbar spine, and you can color in where the muscles are. This is a chimp over here. It's much smaller than we see in a monkey. And so you can also see, again, this vertebral invagination, which muscles aren't smaller, but they're further back, so they get extra leverage, like the big kid, you know, with a big kid and a little kid on the teeter-totter, little kid's got to move pretty far out to do the same amount of work. Because you have more leverage. And so we see these changes that are reflecting that move to passive stabilization in these great apes, especially the great apes, and make them very strong. And why are these other changes taking place? I don't really know. It could be, though, that when you make the rib cage shorter, there's a lot of things inside your torso, organs and so forth inside there. And it could be that as you make it all shorter, you need to change some of the geometry. So if you have, for example, enough room for, say, your lungs, which we know scale isometrically with body mass. And so some of these shape changes could be a volumetric consideration. As you're stiffening that spine, you have to change some shapes to fit everything else in. And I don't really have good data on this. It's amazing how much I can't find in the literature about monkey lungs, but there could be some basic geometric things here. But what we can say is that the variation we see in torso morphology is related to locomotion, but not as we thought. Apes have shorter but not wider rib cages. This doesn't seem to be particularly tightly related to what's going on with the upper limb. And together, this whole torso as one unit works to provide a stable platform for these forelimb-dominated arboreal animals. And some of the other features may be related to these length differences and passive stabilization. So there still is a locomotor signal, but the why reason is changing. So how is this useful to get back to what I told you I was going to talk about? I'll talk about this ape called Rudipithecus. It lived in Hungary about 10 million years ago. It's plausibly closely related to the African ape and human clade. You can ask different people, they'll give you different answers to that, but it's somewhere in there. And it's cool because there's this pelvis. And the pelvis is great, but it's missing the top part, it's missing the middle parts, and it's kind of broken up. But fortunately, we can use sort of some new 3D, non-landmark based CAD ways of looking at this and make some comparisons. And this is just sort of a quick summary of what we can tell from this. So here's an ape over here, the siamang. It's hanging by its branches. It's got a huge amount of hip mobility to reach around in the trees compared with the monkey that's walking above branches. It's also holding its body in orthograde or upright position, which is what these animals tend to do when they're moving in the trees. We can look at the hip joint and we can see that it's expanded in the cranial portion, and the ape, just Rudipithecus here, just like the ape, as opposed to being uniform distribution in this monkey, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so it looks like Rudipithecus would have had upright posture. Ashley Hammond, when she's a curator of biological anthropology at the AMNH, when she was a graduate student, she came up with this nifty way of digitally articulating the thigh and the pelvis together, was able to determine that the range of motion of Rudipithecus would have been very much more like the siamang than you see like this monkey over here. So it would have had flexible hip joints, upright posture, which means that this reconstruction might not be too far off of what we're seeing. But what about the pelvis and the torso? Well, we can measure how widely flaring that iliac blade is at upper part of the pelvis by fitting circles to it. And sure, it seems to be flaring pretty much. These are all apes down here. It seems to be pretty much like an ape there. That's good. We can also measure the orientation of that overall part of the iliac blade. And sure enough, it's pretty rotated like you would see in a great ape. In the parts preserved, it's missing the top, but it still works. What's weird though is the pelvis isn't long. It's looking sort of ape-like, modern great ape-like, recited African ape-like. This is good, but it's short. It's shorter than a lot of monkeys. It's a really short little pelvis. And so this gave us another year's worth of consternation before we get the thing published, trying to figure out what this all means. And again, it comes back to allometry. So here's the monkeys over here, and here's apes over here. This happens to be a chimp, the long pelvis, very flaring at the top, and so on and so forth. These are gibbons and siamangs. These are the lesser apes, the hand-over-hand brachiators. They're more sort of cocker spaniel size than great ape size. And in fact, if you take Rudipithecus, it's almost in parts preserved, a dead ringer in some ways, in the upper part of the pelvis at least, for a siamang. So what does this mean? Well, I told you already there's a lot of allometry. As you go from a gibbon to a large great ape, you can see the lower back gets shorter, the pelvis gets apparently wider, but we know that's everything's getting short. Lumbar spine gets smaller. And when we look at the body size of Rudipithecus, just like most other Miocene apes for some reason, they're much smaller than modern great apes are. They're a little bit bigger than a siamang, but not much. And so the anatomy fits exactly what we would expect of a modern ape of its size in terms of torso morphology. So coming back to our tree again, we know from the fossil record that everyone was pretty much doing the above branch quadrupedal thing up through about the middle Miocene, except for newshounds. Maybe there's an ape called Rudipithecus that was in the news recently. Another story I'd be happy to talk about later, which means that gibbon siamangs may have evolved the suspensory adaptation independently. Orangutans may have evolved their arboreal suspensory adaptations independently. And then it makes you wonder, well, what about gorillas and chimpanzees? Because if they did it independently, that would have real implications for reconstructing the ancestral morphology from which we evolved. Well, it's only then towards the end of the Miocene, you're getting close to the time where you're getting animals that are plausibly related somewhere to great apes and humans. They're starting to probably behave in more sort of modern ape-like locomotor ways, if you will. And each of these apes obviously has their own flavor to what they do in the trees. I'm over emphasizing their similarities here. But these are animals that are probably starting to be more orthograde, to do more climbing, more forelimb dominated behaviors. Many of them have longer arms and longer curved fingers and some other things. But they weren't really built like chimps or gorillas or orangutans. Even when we get to some of those earliest members of the hominin clade, like Rudipithecus reconstruction shown here, they're not necessarily particularly, we don't have a lot of the information in here, this is definitely a reconstruction, but they don't really have anything particularly chimpy, if you will, about their torso anatomy. The pelvis is short and so on and so forth. So even those are not really reinforcing an idea that, at least in terms of the torso, that chimps or gorillas are maybe the best model for the last common ancestor that we would have shared with chimpanzees. And a lot of this may have to do with body size. Great apes are ridiculously large animals. They're huge, and they live in the trees, and they eat fruits that live in the smallest branches of the trees, and they move from tree to tree as best they can. Chimps and gorillas are spending a lot of time in the ground due to their habitat. Orangutans probably didn't used to until we were eating too much Nutella and growing palm oil. But they're very, very large. And so they're anatomically very specialized. To be able to move around in the trees like this at a large size increases the mechanical requirements of being able to do this grow exponentially as you get larger and larger. And that's what the great apes have done. Whereas these Miocene apes, these are just a few random reconstructions here, may have behaviorally been fairly similar, but because most of them weren't quite as large in body size, they were not as specialized anatomically, at least in the core part of their body, to being able to do this. So this brings us back to the age-old question of human evolution. Why did we stand up from all fours? And this is where I should, the Leakey Foundation people are throwing at me things about me, their logo. But if we assume that we evolved from an ancestor that was very chimp-like, we imagine, like the old Time Life, early 1970s, late 60s diagrams here, that we would have stood up from all fours to become biped. We know Australopithecus were good bipeds. Whether they're exactly like us or not, we can argue about. But this question has fueled a lot of speculation as to why we stood up from all fours. What was it? Why? But if we look at the fossil record, and we remember that chimps and hominids have been evolving for just as long from an ancestor, if we imagine for a moment as a thought experiment that an ancestral morphology may have been more like one of these later Miocene apes, not necessarily Rudipithecus, but there are other Pithecuses from that time period. And we imagine that chimps got larger and larger and larger, and were still largely ripe fruit specialists. They evolved these anatomical specializations to maintain that lifestyle with increasing body size, for whatever reason that happened, I don't know. And our ancestors perhaps did something different. So at the end of the Miocene, the beginning of the Pliocene, there was a global cooling and drying. Forests are shrinking, grasslands are expanding, animals are having to make different choices. And it could very well be that the early hominins, when they had to move from tree patch to tree patch, moved on the ground like they did in the trees, which is mostly upright, which they could do because they didn't have all the extreme anatomical specializations we see in great apes. And maybe that was the foundation for the origins of bipedality. So I always like to imagine that maybe the question we shouldn't be asking is, why did we stand up from all fours? But why did we never drop down on all fours to begin with? Might be wrong, might be right, not sure. But I think there are a lot more and more evidence is suggesting this is the case. And if anybody was here at Cal Academy when I did a Leakey Foundation lecture, I think in maybe 2014 or so, I was pitching some of this then. There's a lot more evidence now. And the closer we look at things, the more nuanced it's becoming. But the more I think that this is at least a good question to be asking of all of the data. So I will leave it there and say thank you to these and probably a whole bunch of other people that didn't make it onto the slide. I thank you all for sticking it out with me today, especially if you did another talk this morning. And I hope at least that you have maybe a new way to think about things when you're thinking about early hominids and late apes and our evolutionary history. And so I will leave it there and say thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. We have a couple comments and questions from online that I'm going to read off quickly, if that's okay. First of all, I just want to say thank you to all of our live viewers. We had nearly 50 here in our audience, and we had some calling in from Toronto and Brazil, so that was really exciting.
Oh, that's cool.
So first question we have here is, where does O negative blood come from?
Oh boy, is that not a question for me?
I think we might have to consult some.
If anybody here knows the answer to that question,
I think Shannon.
don't know.
Shannon might. She just left the room, unfortunately. I'm sorry. I'm sorry,
for whoever
commenter.
that was.
I'm so sorry. We'll get back to you. So the next question we have here. Let's see. I think that might have actually been it. I think we might have just stumped ourselves, other than just
All right.
great compliments all around. I'm actually going to pass to Laura to kick off Q&A for the
Sure.
room.
Shall I unshare
Thanks.
this?
Yes,
Ah, great. There we go.
whatever you want to share is
animals, you're not going to get the right answer. For example, if you only used extant apes, you end up with, and you can do the cladistics and you get relationship with molecular data and so forth, we end up with one answer. Whereas you put in fossils, it becomes more complicated because they're less complete. We don't have genetic data, molecular data, we can't be sure. We have morphology sometimes from one or small number of body parts, which means you're only really looking at a very sort of impoverished data set to make it happen. So the way I view cladistics, it's a great way to generate hypotheses of relationships, but it should never be taken as the be all and end all answer, if that's an answer. Yeah. Yeah, you bet. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm interested in the line.
Yeah.
And you're telling me that we can't. Because the playground says we can't, but that's actually what we're interested in.
It is. It is. I played fast and loose with the Miocene apes because, and admittedly, I gave this talk at the American Museum, and I think I just about got dogpiled from many people in the audience for doing something like that, which is fair enough. There are hypotheses of relationships among all of these fossil apes. A lot of them are quite disputed, partly because the fragmentary nature of the fossil record means that you can make your cladogram this way or this way, and it's equally parsimonious. And so it gets really hard to answer that question. So for the purposes I'm talking about here, I can get away with it because if we had a slightly different phylogeny, what I'm talking about wouldn't really be affected super much, but it is super important and it should certainly be done right. And no one should do what I just did. Yeah. As with all things in science, I think it depends on your question and how you're using the data. It does matter actually if, for example, say Rudipithecus, because that's one we actually know a little more about than some others, if it's more closely related to chimps and humans, say, than it is to gorillas, that might mean something quite different than if it's outside gorillas, if you will. That would really change our understanding of the ancestral states. So it makes a huge difference, but we don't know yet some of it. So what we need to do is ask the questions that we can answer with the data that we have, knowing full well that even the things I'm talking about would be really different. We could find people sometimes in public talk say, if you could find any fossil, what would it be? What fossil hominid is it? It wouldn't be. It would be a fossil chimpanzee, about 4 million year old fossil chimpanzee. That's what I want, because that would answer so many of our questions. We just don't have them. So I completely agree with you. But I think it's an important tool, but for when you're working at the fossil record, you need to relax a little bit because sometimes there are things we just don't know yet. I did one cladistic analysis in my life. I was in just the crabbiest mood for 6 months because what's a character? This animal has a vertebra and a jaw, and this one has a femur, and how do you compare them? And it made me really cross the whole time. But it's important and we need to keep at it. But we also have to just, if we don't know, we need to sort of say, well, if this, and see if we can get somewhere that way. Maybe any cladists out there are probably rolling their eyes or shaking their fists at me or something, but that's the best I can do anyway. It's a wonderful tool and it's the right tool, but there's only so much we can do. When you work with fossils and there's little things that, I have a friend who studies dinosaurs, like it's big, beautiful skeletons, and I told him, so, oh, look at this fossil I found. He's like, you even collect this stuff? We'd be saying who could throw it further across the river. Like, no, we can get a lot of information out of these. So we do what we can, as you know. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions that have come in from our online viewers. So one viewer says, thank you so much. In your opinion, what has been the most significant methodological or technological advance in regards to studying the thoracic form in extant and fossil apes and hominins?
I would have to say, at least from my perspective, 3D visualization tools, CT scanning, 3D visualization and analysis has been the technology there has been growing leaps and bounds, and it has really enabled us to see things in new ways. When I started this, I was just picking up one bone at a time with my literally protractor with a string tied in the middle, measuring angles and things. And you get one picture, but when you can see the whole animal and how it's put together, and eventually seeing all the muscles, for anybody who's gets to hear me again tomorrow night. I'll be giving a public talk, and we're actually looking at 3D visualization. You can see muscles and inside muscles, and you can see a lot of other things in animals. And I think that kind of technology is going to really help us, for people at least who are trying to look at bones and make sense out of bones, because animals are more than just bones, or their behavior, first of all, which we have to try to figure out what we can say intelligently about it. But certainly be able to see all the soft tissues, how everything puts together, is really important. I would also say experimental work on modern animals is really wonderful for seeing how modern animals work and how that's related to their anatomy. We can pull some of that information back to the fossil record. And so those to me are the sort of new ways we're going to get moving forward. There's a lot of engineering modeling that people can do actually to look at forces. And if something's built this way and an animal behaves a particular way, it's going to put forces through that bone. And could that bone actually withstand those forces? Or were they doing something else that the forces came the other way, for example? So I think all of those 3D visualization, analysis, CAD drawing, musculoskeletal modeling, making animals move, building them the way you think they would have, and see how they move. There's tremendous advances in this. And I think the tools that we have to take back to the fossil record are just growing exponentially. It's really exciting.
Another online viewer says your talk was very interesting. Do you have any thoughts on the driving force for the ape-monkey split, specifically along the line of the ape-hominid specialization when facing fewer trees?
Sure. The ape-monkey split's a really interesting one, and we don't actually know it particularly well. When I say monkeys, there are platyrrhine monkeys that live in South America that are not that probably branched off well over 35 million years ago-ish or so. And then there's monkeys that live in Africa and Asia called Cercopithecids, and those are the sister group of apes. So the split between the Cercopithecids and hominoids is the one I think you're probably thinking of, person who asked the question. We don't have a good fossil record of fossil Cercopithecid monkeys per se. They show up in the middle Miocene. What's interesting about them is they tend to be smaller and more terrestrial. So that they may have gotten, there were dozens and dozens of ape species occupying the trees for the most part. This is a bit of a glib answer, but occupying the trees in the most part. And it may be that Cercopithecid monkeys got their footing, if you will, terrible word, footing on the ground, actually being terrestrial kind of animals. And then the Asian ones and the African ones may actually seem to have maybe reinvaded the arboreal niche, are now living up in the trees. So back when that split happened, there were lots of apes and very few monkeys. And now, of course, there are lots of monkeys and very few apes. So that dynamic is really, really interesting. And to get a better fossil record of monkeys would help us also. We actually have a lot more evidence of fossil apes probably because there were more of them around.
Over here.
Thanks. So I'm going to get this wrong. I was just asking Craig to tell me about the isotope mystery that's just emerged from that Ugandan site. And I'm going to, you know what I'm talking about, because I think you said you can ask me about, is it Rudipithecus we now got?
Yeah.
And so
Yes.
among the things that I found mind-blowing about that stuff was the claim about having a stiff back, making it easier to get to the tips of the trees where the better leaves are.
Mhm.
And I think of monkeys really being good at that. And I have kind of thought of orangutans as clamorers. And so anyway, among the many questions that arise out of that paper, take your pick.
All right. Well, I'll talk about backs because I like backs. So for those who don't know, there's a site in Moroto in Uganda that's about 20 million years old or so. And this whole story that I'm telling about apes eating fruits and living on trees, and that's where the sort of orthograde clambering adaptation came from, is an interesting one because there's an ape from that site called Rudipithecus that is known, it's got some vertebrae associated with it, and they seem to be much more like living great apes than we see in other fossil apes of the time period. And there's a piece of a shoulder and there's a piece of a femur, and thing looks much more sort of like an orthograde clambering kind of an animal. Phylogenetically, it doesn't necessarily seem to have anything to do. It's also very old, before the split with gorillas and chimps and humans. They wouldn't have even diverged yet. So this animal's sort of been lingering out there. I usually have on the edge of my cladogram with a little question mark, just to be even worse with my cladograms. Don't even try. But it came out that that recently in Science a couple of weeks ago, that this area's actually had expanding grasslands, which we didn't really expect to have happen there. And I can't speak to the isotope part of it per se, but the argument is that this was also a habitat that was opening up, sort of like perhaps we might imagine in Eastern Africa at around 6-8 million years ago or so. And I love the story because Rudipithecus seems to be doing similar things that we see in these extant apes, where it's maybe moving towards a four-limb dominated way to move around. And Rudipithecus was also maybe 35 kilograms or so, which is a little bit smaller than a small chimp, but a big animal trying to get to the ends of the leaves if that's what they were eating. So it might have been doing a similar thing that modern apes were doing to maybe get to the fruits or cross bridge gaps in the canopies and so forth, of using forelimbs to move around the trees rather than walking on top of all fours, if you will. So the quadrumanous clambering, climbing kind of thing. So to me, and I haven't actually talked to the authors of this paper, I was hoping to catch them at the anthropology meetings a couple weeks ago and didn't. But to me, this actually supports the idea that as you begin to do these sorts of behaviors, the anatomies repeat themselves. These similar animals doing similar kinds of things have similar changes. We know that some South American monkeys, spider monkeys, which have prehensile tails, they're a different kettle of fish in some ways. They also move around using their forelimbs more in the trees, and they converge upon apes in some of these morphologies that I've talked about today. So to me, that Rudipithecus story is really exciting because it confirms the link perhaps between being able to move around a tree. If you're a big animal, you're walking on tops of the branches, you can't get out to the ends of them, right? Very particularly well. So you have to find another way to do it. And I think Rudipithecus was doing the same sort of thing. So yeah, sure. Well, I think it's because you're passively stabilizing your back, so you can, your latissimus dorsi, the big muscle that you're pulling around in the trees, and the other muscles are stiff. You don't have to stabilize your spine in order to be able to move around with your upper limbs. I think the stiff back is associated with stiffening the back so you can anchor the muscles to move around. It uses less effort. It also protects your vertebral column or your spinal cord, which is running up the middle of your vertebral column and so forth. So I think Rudipithecus is doing the same kind of thing that modern apes have done at maybe a lesser scale. If that answers your question. Thank you. Or not, we can talk about it more, but I think they're doing a parallel kind of solution to a similar problem. Can I use the word parallel? A similar solution to a similar problem. Because homoplasia, again, we see homoplasia in this. I think gibbons and siamangs may have done it, orangutans may have done it, Rudipithecus may have done it, and so forth. And chimps and gorillas maybe not. That's my take on it anyway. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Anyone ever asked about tails, the loss of tails among the nature that has anything to do with this?
Oh, that's a great question. The apes,
They have tails and
right?
so-
Yeah, I used to teach my students in class. A curious George is not a curious little monkey. He's a curious little ape because he doesn't have a tail. Yeah, apes don't have tails. That's one of the features that unites all of apes, one of the shared drive features. It seems that tails were lost back when apes were still above branch quadrupedal animals. Back 40 years ago or so, the idea was that as you begin to hold your body upright, you take all those muscles that move the tail and you need to support your viscera. You need to make muscles and soft tissues in a pelvic floor to keep all your insides in. And that's why the tail was lost. But then we found in an animal that was called proconsul, now called a kembo, it's about 20 million years old, didn't have a tail. And that thing was really pretty quadrupedal as far as we can tell. So it seems that tails were lost for a different reason. Why? Lorises don't have tails. They're little small animals, but they move very slowly. They hold on. Tails in a lot of animals used for balance and running and turning and so on and so forth. And if you're moving very slowly in the trees, it may just not be that much more that useful. And who knows, you can have predators grab it or what have you, and you have to pay energy to build it, and a bunch of reasons that selection might just do away with it if you don't need it. So the idea is that maybe as you started clambering around in the trees, even on all fours. So the story kind of goes, with these akembo, these early stem hominoids. They were above branch quadruped, but they had a little bit more sort of mobile joints, if you will, designed to move in different ways. Grasping seems to be a little bit more significant than we see in a lot of monkeys that are just kind of walking on top. And that would have been associated with tail loss, and that would have sort of been the beginnings of this ape shift, if you will. And then eventually they did the orthograde, long upper limb kind of thing. That's a great question. And we still don't really have a good idea of the origin of the pelvic floor in humans, actually. It's a great project, but that would be a great one for 3D imaging.
We're still having problems.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you all for coming online and in person. Just a reminder that Dr. Ward will be speaking again tomorrow evening at the Commonwealth Club in downtown San Francisco at 6 p.m. Please go to the Leakey Foundation website for more information about that and to reserve your tickets. I think you'll all agree with me that it's sure to be a really exciting and interesting and invigorating conversation. Huge thanks to the Leakey Foundation for all of their contributing and continuing partnership with us here at the Academy, and especially for bringing Dr. Ward to us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. That was a great talk, and we're so pleased that you were here with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you all.